you. My name is Rhett Jones, and I'm a third-year law student over at the Law College. I am part of the Entrepreneurship Legal Clinic. Just a little bit of a background for those of you who might not be as familiar with the clinic. We're located over in the Law College, and we help startups generally in the Lincoln or Omaha area, but we've also worked with startups in the greater Nebraska area, facing all sorts of legal issues. Specifically, this semester, for example, I've done some entity formation work. We do a lot with the USPTO, specifically trademarks. I've also done some work with nonprofits, other intellectual property advising. Got a lot of information today, so if we could do questions at the end, that would be great. And if you would like some more information about the clinic, Leanne in the back has some flyers as well as business cards with information about the Entrepreneurship Clinic. So here's sort of just a couple of things I'm going to be talking about today, starting with choosing the right structure, which is probably the most important thing for a startup to consider, and along with that is naming the company and registering it, and just various issues with co-founders. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about independent contractors and employee issues, employment issues that kind of come up when you're starting a company. And then I'm also going to be talking briefly about intellectual property ownership and assignment. So what kind of company to start? There are sort of main ones that people hear about the most are limited liability companies, partnerships, C corporations, and S corporations. There's different factors you have to consider with all of them, taxes, liability, a bunch of things like that. So I'm going to kind of just go through them all. Starting with the LLC, which is sort of more popular and a little more up and coming. It's got, the benefits of it is that it's a lot less formal than a corporation. You have a lot more flexibility. It's usually managed sort of by your direct owners. And then the biggest advantage that people like is the limited liability, meaning that you're not personally liable if the company is sued versus in a partnership or a sole proprietor, in which case you are personally liable, which means that if your partner signs a contract or something like that that you don't agree with, and you're sued for it as a company, they will go after you. There are a couple downsides, though, to the limited liability company, and that investors tend to not favor it, venture capitalists tend to not favor it, just because with the pass-through taxation, you're taxed even if there's no distribution. So in pass-through taxation, it goes through the entity and you're taxed directly as members. And a lot of times, if there aren't distribution schedules or something like that, then you're going to get taxed and you might not have the funds to pay for it. So it's not very favored by investors for the taxation reasons usually. The partnership is the next one that I put up there. I highly, highly encourage people to not be in a partnership, but it's important to consider because it's automatic if you don't have another entity formed. So if you and a friend or even a coworker are starting a business and you don't form a corporation or an LLC, you're going to end up in a partnership, which has that unlimited liability that I mentioned before. So that's something I really highly, and we at the clinic really don't recommend that people have. It's operated by a partnership agreement if you have one, which if you are going to be a partnership, I also recommend because otherwise there's statutory guidelines that you'll end up with. Which might not be what you really want to have. Next are the corporations. Most people are more familiar with these. The C corporation and the S corporation. The C corporation, you can have a Nebraska corporation or any other state, or the other really common one is a Delaware corporation. A lot of companies choose to be Delaware corporations, and a lot of investors prefer Delaware corporations because there's just a lot of case law, there's a lot of statutory guidance, there's just a lot more behind Delaware corporation. The benefits to the corporation is that you can have an unlimited amount of shareholders, there's a lot of case law, as I've said. The ownership transfer is really easy, so if you have a lot of investors and everything, or you have partners that end up wanting out, it's the easiest way to do it. Some of the drawbacks that some people don't like is that it's a lot more formal, it's a lot more annual meetings, more reports are required. It's just a lot more structured. Some people like that, some people don't. And then the S corporation is essentially the same thing, except you have the pass-through taxation of a partnership that I mentioned. So instead of a corporation which has a double taxation, which is at the corporate level and then again at the individual level, this just passes through to the individuals. The downside sort of to an S corporation, which again make it not as popular for the same reasons as the LLC, is that there's a lot of formalities on who can be an owner for an S corporation. So you have to have under 100 owners, they all have to be domestic, and it can only be individuals. And you can only have one stock of class, which means that investors and venture capitalists really can't be a part of an S corporation, so that can hurt if you want a lot of outside funding. So that's sort of an overview of the structures. Now I'm going to go into a little bit more of the formation and the legalities behind each of them. So to form an LLC, the steps that you need to take, you have to check the Secretary of State website for the name. It's always good to have a couple backup names for your company because a lot of times they're registered even if you don't realize it. And then the only documentation that's actually required with the state to get an LLC formed is the certificate of organization. You file it with the things that are listed up there, and you have to keep it updated because if you need to be served or there's anything from the state, they need to be able to contact you. Publication, a lot of people don't realize that you have to do this. Not every state requires it, but a lot of states do, so you need to check on this, that you have to basically put a notice for 3 straight weeks in a legal newspaper or journal saying that you are now an LLC. An LLC is governed by an operating agreement, which is not required, but it's highly, highly recommended. I'm going to go into that for a little bit. Operating agreement is, it's how your company is run. So it's the membership interest, it's the contributions, which in the beginning is really important because you're going to maybe have some people who are just contributing money, some are going to be contributing property, intellectual property or tangible property, services. Some people will just be working and not actually contributing any IP or anything, but you're going to have founders that are going to be managing the company. So those are things that you need to think about at the beginning to go into the operating agreement. Allocations and distributions is a really important one for the reasons that I talked about with the tax structure, because you want to be able to give distributions to the members of your company so that when that tax liability does come through and is passed through based on any profits or losses for the company, the members have the ability to pay it, especially in a startup when funds might be more limited. This is a really important thing to have in your operating agreement. The management structure you can outline in there with the limitations on power, whether or not you're going to have the members actually manage it or you're going to hire a manager to manage it. And then you also want to talk about transferring membership interests and the dissolution of the LLC, which can kind of go hand in hand. So like I said, it's not quite as easy to transfer interest as a corporation. So you need to think about illness, death, if somebody wants out of a corporation. These are things that nobody likes to think about at the beginning, but they're things that you should have in there in case they come up. And then other provisions, the nice thing about an LLC operating agreement is it can be as detailed or as vague as you really want it to be. So you can put in provisions about employees, confidentiality, that's a big one, especially if you're going to have tech startups, licenses, intellectual property, etc. Now, for corporation formation, whether or not it's an S corporation or C corporation, it's kind of a similar process, just a little bit more in depth. So again, Secretary of State website will have all the information that you need, name of corporation, and then you have to file the articles of incorporation with the state. So the name, the number of shares, and the par value with the minimum value, and then your agent and address of incorporator. And then again, there's a publication requirement, but you should know that if you're doing a Delaware corporation, which a lot of people do, then there is no publication requirement there. The bylaws are the governing documents for the corporation, the shareholders, when they meet, when they vote, the board members, how long the board members are going to be on there, what happens if there's a vacancy, officers, salaries, all of the kind of standard operating things of a corporation. And then importantly, like what needs the approval of the shareholders versus what the board can sort of do on their own. And then you can also outline things like dividends, when and how they're going to be distributed, etc. And as I mentioned, the corporation is a lot more formal than the LLC. So these are just some of the formalities that you need to consider before you form or while you're working on your formation. So you need to appoint directors and have a first board meeting. You're going to appoint the people that will last until the meeting, and then it's not until that first board meeting that you'll appoint the officers and adopt the bylaws, issue stock, which you'll need to check securities laws and talk to someone about securities laws if you're not familiar with them before you do anything with the stock. And then there's other considerations, licenses, you need to get an EIN for your business. And then the S corporation election, this is when you'll do that if you decide to be an S corporation. And one important thing to note here, it's important if you want to be an S corporation, all of the shareholders in your company have to agree to do that. So if one of the founders doesn't want to, then you're not going to be able to be an S corporation. So that is when you would do that. And then just because it is so important, here's just sort of an outline of the different tax considerations for each of them. Single member LLC as well as a sole proprietorship, the entity is disregarded. It's just taxed on your individual return. A general partnership or an LLC, again, has no tax at that partner level or company level, and it flows through to the partners. And with the LLC and everything, it's in proportion to your interest that it would flow through. The C corporation is the double taxation that a lot of people are familiar with. It's taxed once at the corporate level and then again at the individual level. And the S corporation also has the flow-through taxation, and that is again taxed regardless of whether or not there is actually distribution. So that's sort of all of the entity formation part of it. I'm going to go into a couple of employment considerations and things that you need to think about when you're hiring people for your startup. So the biggest things to think about are whether or not the person is going to be a founder or an employee, especially at the beginning, and then whether or not the person is going to be an employee or an independent contractor. And that's kind of the biggest thing that people mess up the most, and that's what can get a lot of people into trouble. Part-time versus full-time employees. IP ownership and assignment is a really important one, and it's one that you really want to have in any contract that you have, whether or not it's with a employee or an independent contractor. And then compensation, confidentiality, especially if you've got a lot of trade secrets, a lot of tech and IP that you want to protect. And then non-compete clauses. A lot of people would really like to have non-compete clauses, which is when you basically tell one of your employees that they can't work for a competing company if they leave your company. The unfortunate thing about those is that Nebraska courts do not like them, and they usually will cut them out of a contract and not uphold them. So employee or independent contractor, the control over the person that you're hiring is probably the most important thing. Everyone would like to have independent contractors hired, because an independent contractor, you just pay them, you don't have to worry about any of the tax withholding or deductions or insurance or workers' comp or anything like that. They have to take care of it themselves. So that's what everyone would like to have. A lot of times people that are classified as independent contractors are website designers and the like. So you need to think about things like, are they using your equipment? Are you telling them what to do? And things like that. If they're coming into work and doing a lot of stuff for you and using your equipment, they're probably an employee, even if they're there for only a short amount of time, versus a contractor where you sort of give them a job and they would do it themselves. But that misclassification is probably one of the biggest issues that is run into. And like I said, it really matters for tax purposes, because if they're found to be employees and you've been paying them as independent contractors, then you're in trouble for the taxation. And then the next, and one more thing, sorry. The test for an independent contractor or an employee is really long. It's like 26 factors that go into it. So if you have someone that you're kind of on the fence about, I would ask an attorney. It's a pretty quick thing to run through, but it is a lot of factors. And then IP assignment and ownership. Again, this matters sort of along the work for hire, if you're working for the university. As mentioned before, anything that you're making will belong to the university, and it's the same as if it's important also if you're starting a company that's separate from the university, you want to think about people that you're bringing in and you want them to sign something that is going to assign any sort of tech or intellectual property work product to you or your company, whether or not it's an independent contractor or an employee. You want to have something in their contract that says everything that is made is going to be assigned to the company and not to them. So that is sort of just a brief overview of some of those issues. And just to summarize, these are kind of the biggest things that everyone needs to think about. With the entity formation, you need to consider whether or not you really are going to have investors or you're sort of doing a bunch of self-funding. Because if you want to have venture capitalists and other large investment groups, then something like an LLC is probably not the best option for you. Just issues with co-founders, how much everyone is bringing into the company. Tax considerations, again, the double taxation of a corporation versus the pass-through tax of an LLC. Liability considerations, especially if you're in a partnership or sole proprietorship. You're going to be a lot more personally liable than you would if you have sort of a corporate structure that will guard you from that. And then employment issues, as I mentioned, employee or independent contractor is the biggest issue that comes up usually at the beginning, and intellectual property protection. So that's sort of a very brief run through of basically what we do at the clinic all semester with our clients. And there's some information about the clinic. If anyone has any questions, I can take them now. I've got a couple minutes.
So we have about 5 minutes for questions.
Yes.
So we formed a company, a C corporation, and when the company first started, all individuals were playing an active part. And then a year later or so, we have an individual that doesn't really contribute much to this company anymore. How do we make those decisions on whether, how we get rid of that individual, how is it done, particularly in C corporation?
Well, something like that, a lot of times will be drafted into bylaws. People will have options where the corporation could repurchase the stock or something like that. A lot of times it's governed within your bylaws.
So you essentially just force them out based upon what you have written in the company policy.
Yeah, I mean, that's why the entity formation and that's why all of the documents at the beginning, it's really important to have all of that thought about in there, because that's what you basically are going to have to use in order to force them out, is anything that you've written into your bylaws about it. I mean, it's
Not an easy thing to see to do.
I mean, it's difficult and it's hard, and there's a lot of considerations based on like whether or not they're a majority shareholder or not, because it's a lot easier to get rid of sort of a minority shareholder than it is the main person in the company. Yes?
Does the clinic have kind of like templates and things for forming, some of the legal jargon you need to put into your bylaws, like what needs to be there, that you could use to start like a rough draft with entity formation?
I don't know if we have necessarily templates. We do have some things that I could send to NUtech that just have organizational charts of all of the different types of entities and everything, that's sort of all the different factors and everything. We might have, I'm sure that we have some memos and some templates that have information, and then the Secretary of State's website also will have all of that. And the nice thing about that website is you can look up a lot of articles of incorporation and information from other companies and sort of see what they've done. So, but most of the website's pretty easy to navigate, and they have most of the information. So, yes.
If I start a company at the beginning as a LLC, you don't have to change it to a corporation?
Sorry, can you change it?
Yeah, change it to.
Yes, you can. You can switch entities. And a lot of companies do. The LLC is, it's becoming more popular, and it's a more popular sort of the fewer owners that you have at the beginning. So I have a client that I work with that's just about 4 or 5 people, and they've formed an LLC. But if they expand and they end up wanting a lot of outside investors, then you can transition from an LLC to a corporation. Yeah.
You might talk a little bit about what it takes to be able to participate with the clinic. Are there any requirements in terms of who comes to you?
There's a couple. There's an application process. I know we have about 52 applications currently. So we're working through that now for the summer class. But basically, there's certain things that the clinic can't do. So if it's a patent thing, we can't do patents because the attorney that we work under, Rhett Jones, can't prosecute patents. So that's not something that we really work on. But basically, it's startups in the area, anyone that needs help. One of the things that we mention is that's sort of in our guidelines is that you might not have gone to a lawyer otherwise had it not been for the clinic. So I work with a lot of student clients, and the clinic works with a lot of student clients, people who wouldn't necessarily have the money to drop to go and get all of their documents filed. But if you go to the clinic website, and we also have a Facebook page, there's a lot about the application process, and it's a form that you fill out, and then Leah or Brett will get back to you, and there's sort of an interview process where we figure out what the legal needs are, because it's also a learning opportunity for us, the students, so it sort of varies. They try to get a lot of different variations on what we have in the clinic, but we try to match students' needs within the semester time restraint with the client's needs.
And how many clients typically would you have?
20 to 24-ish. So, because I have 3 right now, 2 of which I share with another student because they have more issues that we work through. And then I have 1 client who's a carryover client. So that's another thing that we can do, especially for trademarks, because sometimes that process takes longer than a semester would. And so I'm doing an appeal right now from a student last semester who filed the trademark. So if it's not covered in the semester, I can't move on to the next semester depending